I knew I was breaking the law the moment I looked at him for too long. Not in a vague, "this could get me in trouble someday" kind of way. I mean actually illegal. The kind of thing that could cost me my job, my family, maybe even my freedom if the wrong person decided to care. And still, I didn't look away. It was a stupid place for it to start too. A gym. Bright lights, cheap equipment, and the constant feeling that someone might be watching, not in a paranoid way, just the reality of living where I did. People watched. People talked. People reported things that didn't fit. And guys like me? We learned early how to disappear in plain sight. My name's Gareth. I was 27 at the time, working a boring office job I hated but couldn't leave. I kept my head down, said the right things, dated women when it felt necessary, and never gave anyone a reason to question me. It wasn't living. It was surviving. Then Larry showed up. He didn't look like trouble at first. Just another guy at the gym. Mid-30s maybe, a little older than me, solid build, the kind of presence that made you notice him without understanding why. Not flashy. Not loud. Just grounded. Confident in a quiet way. The first time I really noticed him was because he noticed me. I was at the dumbbell rack, pretending to focus on my set, when I caught him in the mirror. Just a glance. Quick. But not accidental. I looked away immediately. That instinct was automatic. Years of conditioning. But later, it happened again. And again. That's how it starts, I guess. Not with words. Just these tiny, almost invisible moments. The kind that don't mean anything, until they do. For 2 weeks, that's all it was. We never spoke. Not once. But we learned each other's routines. Or maybe just fell into them. Same time every evening. Same general area. Always aware, never obvious. It was a silent agreement. I see you. You see me. That's as far as this goes. Because anything more? That's where things got dangerous. And I knew that better than anyone. Where I lived, people disappeared for less. I wish I could say I was strong enough to walk away. That I recognized the risk and chose safety. But that's not what happened. What happened was, one night, everything slipped. It was late. The gym was almost empty, just a few regulars finishing up. I was on the treadmill, half distracted, when I felt it again, that awareness. Him. I didn't look right away. I told myself not to. Then I did. He was already looking at me. This time, he didn't look away. And something about that broke the pattern. My chest tightened. Not fear exactly. Not yet. Something sharper. Something that had been buried for years pushing its way up like it didn't care about consequences anymore. I stepped off the treadmill before I could overthink it. Stupid. Completely stupid. I grabbed my towel, heading toward the locker room, telling myself I just needed to cool off, reset, be normal again. But as I pushed the door open, he was already inside. For a second, we both froze. That moment stretched longer than it should have. Too long for two strangers. Too long for something that wasn't supposed to exist. "You always leave early?" he asked. His voice caught me off guard. Calm. Low. Like this wasn't insane. Like this was just normal conversation. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay steady. Sometimes. That was it. That was all I gave him. But I didn't leave. And neither did he. He stepped closer, not too close, not enough to raise alarms if someone walked in. Just enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us. "I've seen you here a lot," he said. I let out a quiet breath. Same. There was a pause. Not awkward. Just loaded. Then he said it. "You're careful." Not a question. A statement. My stomach dropped slightly. That wasn't something people said unless they understood. I looked at him properly then, really looked, searching for something. Danger, maybe. Or recognition. "What makes you say that?" I asked. He gave a faint smile. Not smug. Not teasing. Just knowing. Because I am too. That should have been the moment I walked away. That was the line. The point where this stopped being accidental and started being real. And real meant risk. Serious risk. But instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. It hit me so unexpectedly that I almost laughed. Not out loud, but inside, this quiet, disbelieving kind of release. Like I'd been holding my breath for years without realizing it. You shouldn't say things like that, I muttered. I know, he replied. Neither of us moved. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything we weren't saying. Every rule we were breaking just by standing there. Then, quietly, he added, "But you didn't walk away." And that was the problem. Because he was right. I didn't. I should have. God, I really should have. But instead I stayed. And that was the first real mistake I made with Larry. Not the last. Not even close. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because anything actually happened, nothing did. We didn't touch, didn't say anything that could get either of us in real trouble. But somehow that made it worse. Because now it was real. Before Larry, everything was hypothetical. Controlled. I could tell myself I was careful enough, distant enough, that nothing would ever cross the line. Now I'd met someone who lived on that same edge, and didn't immediately step back. That changes things. I kept replaying it in my head. The way he said, "You're careful." The way he looked at me like he already knew what I was trying so hard to hide. It wasn't just attraction. It was recognition. And in a place like that, recognition could either be the most dangerous thing in the world, or the only thing that made it bearable. The next evening, I told myself I wouldn't go back. Simple solution, right? Remove the problem. I stayed late at work on purpose. Took my time walking home. Even sat in a cafe for an extra hour just to avoid my usual routine. But the whole time, there was this low, constant pull in my chest. Annoying. Persistent. By the time I got home, I was more restless than when I'd left. So I did what any rational person trying to avoid something would do. I went right back to the gym. The second I stepped inside, I knew that was a mistake. Because I was already looking for him. I hated that part. The way my eyes scanned the room automatically, like I didn't have a say in it. And then I saw him. Same place. Like nothing had changed. Except it had. This time, when our eyes met, either of us pretended it didn't mean anything. I almost turned around right then. Almost. But instead, I grabbed a set of weights and forced myself into my usual routine, trying to act like I wasn't hyper-aware of every movement he made. It didn't work. I could feel him without looking. That same quiet presence, steady and intentional. It was distracting in a way that went deeper than physical attraction. It got into my head. Made me forget where I was. Which, in that country, was not something you could afford to do. I finished quicker than usual, partly because I couldn't focus, partly because I didn't trust myself to stay longer. Locker room again. I should have expected it at that point. He was there. Leaning casually against the row of lockers like he hadn't been waiting, even though he obviously had. I let out a quiet breath, dropping my bag onto the bench. "This is a bad idea," I said under my breath. Larry didn't argue. "Yeah," he replied simply. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Because he still didn't leave. Neither did I. There was something about the way he handled it that made it harder to walk away. No pressure. No pushing. Just honesty. Like he understood the risk just as much as I did, and chose to stay anyway. "You ever think about how stupid this is?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He let out a short, quiet laugh. "Constantly." I glanced at him. And I'm still here." That hit harder than it should have. I shook my head slightly, running a hand through my hair. "You don't even know me." Larry shrugged, pushing off the locker just enough to stand a little closer, not crossing any obvious lines, but close enough that it felt intentional. I know enough. That's not how this works. No, he agreed. It's not. There was a beat of silence. Then he added, quieter this time. That's kind of the problem, isn't it? I didn't answer. Because he was right. There was no way for this to work. No safe version of it. No version where we could just figure things out like normal people. Everything about it was risk. Reputation. Jobs. Family. Safety. Freedom. And still, I didn't leave. Instead, I found myself asking, how long have you been careful? He studied me for a second before answering. Long enough to know when someone else is. That wasn't what I meant. But it was the only answer he was going to give. I nodded slowly, looking down at my hands. Yeah. Another pause. Quieter this time. More dangerous. You ever get tired of it? He asked. That question, that one hit somewhere deeper. Not surface level frustration. Not inconvenience. Something heavier. Years of it. The pretending. The constant awareness. The second guessing every word, every glance, every interaction. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Every day. It slipped out before I could stop it. And the second it did, I felt it, that shift. Something more real than before. Larry didn't react right away. Didn't make it bigger than it was. He just nodded. Yeah, he said quietly. Same. And that was it. No dramatic moment. No big move. Just two people standing too close in a place where even that was a risk, admitting something neither of us could say anywhere else. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. But it did. Because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone in it. And that's exactly what made it dangerous. Not the attraction. Not even the possibility of getting caught. But the fact that I was starting to want something I couldn't have. Something I wasn't allowed to have. And once that starts, it's a lot harder to stop. After that night, things didn't go back to normal. They couldn't. We still didn't exchange numbers. Didn't make any kind of plan. But somehow, an understanding formed anyway. Same time. Same place. Every day. It became routine faster than I'd like to admit. At first, we kept it exactly where it started. Those quiet conversations in the locker room. Short. Careful. Always aware of who might walk in. We never stood too close if someone else was around. Never looked at each other for too long in the open. Out there, we were strangers. Inside, something else. You always been here? I asked him one evening, keeping my voice low as I laced up my shoes. Larry shook his head. Moved here a year ago. For work? Yeah. That was usually as far as we went with personal details. Surface level. Safe topics. Anything deeper felt risky. Because the more you knew about someone, the harder it got to pretend they didn't matter. And pretending was kind of the whole point. But the lines started slipping anyway. Not all at once. Just small things. Like the way he'd stand a little closer when no one else was around. Or how conversations stretched longer than they should. Or how we started timing our workouts without ever actually saying it out loud. One night, I got there later than usual. Work had been a mess, and by the time I walked into the gym, I was already tense, already distracted. And immediately, I knew. He wasn't there. I told myself it didn't matter. That this was better. Safer. I went through my workout, but everything felt off. I couldn't focus, couldn't settle into it. I kept glancing toward the door without meaning to. It was stupid. Completely stupid. But I stayed longer than usual. Just in case. He never showed. By the time I left, my chest felt tight in a way I didn't want to think too much about. That should have been a sign. A warning. Instead, the next day, I showed up even earlier. And he was already there. Leaning against the wall near the entrance, arms crossed, like he'd been waiting. When he saw me, Something in his expression shifted, subtle, but there. Relief. That hit me harder than anything else. You disappeared yesterday, he said as I walked closer. I raised an eyebrow slightly. I could say the same thing. Had to stay late. Same. A pause. Then, almost like he didn't mean to ask, you stayed long? I hesitated for half a second. Yeah. Another pause. We both knew what that meant. Neither of us said it. But something about that exchange, it changed the tone again. This wasn't just coincidence anymore. It wasn't just shared space. We were starting to look for each other. And that was dangerous in a completely different way. You know this doesn't end well, right? I said quietly as we moved toward the weights. Larry let out a soft breath, almost amused. You keep saying that. Because it's true. He nodded. I know. Then why? Because I don't want to stop. That shut me up. Not because I didn't have an argument, but because I didn't have a better answer. I didn't want to stop either. And admitting that, even silently, felt like crossing another line. We worked out side by side that night. Not obviously together. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But close enough that I could feel it. That awareness again. Stronger now. At one point our hands brushed. It was accidental. At least, it should have been. But neither of us pulled away immediately. Just a second too long. Just enough to feel it. That small contact sent something sharp through my chest, like a reminder of how starved I'd been for something as simple as that. I stepped back first. Too quickly. Sorry, I muttered. Larry just shook his head slightly. Yeah. But he didn't look sorry. And that made it worse. Later, in the locker room, the tension was thicker than usual. Not awkward. Just heavier. Like we both felt something shift and didn't know how to handle it. We can't keep doing that, I said, quieter than before. Doing what? You know what. He watched me for a second, then nodded slightly. Okay. But there was something in his tone. Not agreement. More like acknowledgement without intention to change. I exhaled slowly, leaning back against the locker. This is how people get caught. I know. You don't seem that concerned. Larry tilted his head slightly, studying me. You are. Of course I am. He stepped a little closer, not enough to be obvious, but enough that it shifted the space between us again. And you're still here. That again. That same point. And again. I had no answer for it. Because logic didn't matter anymore. Not as much as it should. You're going to get me in trouble, I muttered. A faint smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. You're already in trouble. And the worst part? He was right. Not because of him. But because of how I felt. Because at some point, without realizing it, this stopped being something I could control. It got harder to pretend after that. Not just at the gym, but everywhere. Because once something shifts like that, it doesn't stay contained. I'd catch myself thinking about him at random times. At work, in meetings, walking home. Stupid moments where my brain should have been focused on literally anything else. Instead, it kept going back to him. To us. And I hated how quickly that happened. I'd spent years building control. Careful routines. Clear boundaries. Rules that kept me safe. Larry didn't break those rules. I did. By letting this go further than it ever should have. A few nights later, something happened that made that painfully clear. The gym was busier than usual. Not packed, but enough people that you had to be more aware. More careful. We barely acknowledged each other at first. Just quick glances. Nothing more. That was how it was supposed to be. But halfway through my workout, I noticed something off. Two guys near the back, talking, but not really working out. Watching more than they should. I tried to ignore it at first. Told myself I was being paranoid. But then I caught one of them looking directly at Larry, then at me. And suddenly, everything in my body went tense. That instinct, That survival instinct kicked in immediately. I moved away without thinking. Switched areas. Put distance between us. Didn't look at him again. Didn't dare to. My heart was beating faster now, not from the workout. From something else. Fear. Real fear. Because this wasn't just in my head anymore. This was exactly how things went wrong. You get comfortable. You slip. Someone notices. And then. I didn't even let myself finish that thought. I ended my workout early, grabbed my things, and went straight to the locker room. I needed to get out. Reset. Breathe. A few minutes later, the door opened behind me. I didn't turn around. Gareth. His voice was low. Careful. I clenched my jaw slightly. Don't. A pause. They were watching, he said. I know. You saw it. Yes. Silence. Heavy. Then I finally turned to face him, keeping my voice controlled, but tight. This is what I've been talking about. Larry didn't argue. Didn't brush it off. For the first time since I met him, he looked serious in a different way. I know, he said again. That's not enough. I snapped quietly. Knowing doesn't change anything. He held my gaze. What do you want me to say? I want you to understand that this isn't a game. I do understand. Then act like it. That landed. I could see it. Something in his expression shifted, not defensive, not angry, just more grounded. I'm not the one pretending this is nothing, he said. I frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? It means, he continued, voice steady, you keep acting like this is some small mistake that hasn't already gone too far. That hit harder than I expected. Because, yeah? He wasn't wrong. We can stop, I said quickly. Too quickly. Like I needed to prove it more to myself than to him. Larry studied me for a second. Okay, he said. Just like that. No pushback. No hesitation. And for some reason, that made it worse. Because now it was real. Now it was a choice. I swallowed, forcing myself to nod. Yeah. Okay. Silence settled between us again. Different this time. Colder. More final. He stepped back first. Then be careful, Gareth. Something about the way he said my name, it stuck. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just quiet. And then he left. Just like that. I stood there for a while after. Not moving. Not thinking clearly. Just standing in the middle of a decision I wasn't sure I actually wanted. Because logically, this was the right call. The only call. We got too close. Took too many risks. Someone noticed. End of story. That's how you stay safe. But as I walked home that night, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like I'd just cut something off before it had the chance to become real. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that's what survival looked like. Choosing safety over whatever this was becoming. Still, the next evening, when it was time to go to the gym, I hesitated. Longer than I should have. Because part of me already knew. Stopping wasn't going to be as simple as saying it out loud. I didn't go back the next day. Or the day after that. I told myself I was done. That I meant what I said. That I wasn't stupid enough to push it further after what happened. And for a couple of days, I almost believed that. Life went back to what it used to be. Work. Home. Silence. No tension. No risk. No Larry. It should have felt like relief. Instead, everything felt flat. Like I'd removed something I wasn't supposed to need, but somehow did. I caught myself checking the time in the evenings out of habit. Not even thinking about it at first. Then realizing exactly what I was doing. It pissed me off. Because that meant it got to me more than I wanted to admit. By the third night, I was restless. Couldn't focus. Couldn't settle. So I did the one thing I said I wouldn't do again. I went back. The second I stepped inside, it hit me. That same awareness. Like nothing had changed, except everything had. I didn't look for him right away this time. I tried not to. Forced myself to focus on my workout, keep my head down, stay in my own space. For a while, it worked. Until I turned toward the mirrors. And there he was. Across the room. Already looking at me. It wasn't subtle anymore. Not like before. There was no pretending this was accidental. My chest tightened instantly. For a second, either of us moved. Then I looked away first. Of course I did. I told myself to ignore it. Finish my workout. Leave. That was the plan. But 10 minutes later, he was closer. Not right next to me. Just closer. Enough that I could feel it again. That pull. That tension that never really went away. I set my weights down harder than I meant to. This was a mistake. I muttered under my breath. Probably. His voice. Right behind me. I closed my eyes for a second before turning around. You shouldn't be here, I said quietly. Larry raised an eyebrow slightly. Neither should you. Don't do that. Do what? Act like this is nothing. He studied me for a moment, then shook his head slightly. I'm not. That caught me off guard. Because it didn't feel like deflection. It felt honest. Then why are you here? I asked. A small pause. Then simply. Same reason you are. Yeah. That tracked. I let out a slow breath, running a hand over the back of my neck. We said we'd stop. We did. And we didn't. There it was again. No excuses. No pretending. Just the truth, laid out in a way that made it hard to argue with. This isn't smart, I said. I know. You saw what happened. I did. And you're still here. Larry stepped a little closer, not enough to draw attention, but enough that I had to look at him instead of pretending I could ignore him. So are you. That shut me up. Again. Because every argument I had applied to me just as much. I hated that. I hated how clear it made everything. Because it meant this wasn't on him. It wasn't even really about him. It was about the fact that I didn't want to walk away. Not anymore. The silence stretched between us, thicker than before. More loaded. More dangerous. You came back, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I nodded slightly. Yeah. Another pause. Then softer. So did you. Something shifted again in that moment. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Just deeper. Like we'd both stopped pretending this was temporary. That it would just fade if we ignored it long enough. Because it hadn't. It got stronger. Even with distance. Maybe because of it. Those guys, I said after a second, lowering my voice. They might still be around. Larry nodded. I know. So we need to be smarter. We do. I hesitated. Then added, or we stop. He looked at me for a long second. Not avoiding the question. Not rushing to answer. Just considering it. You want to? He asked. And that was the first time either of us said it like that. Not should we. Not we have to. But do you want to? I opened my mouth to answer. And nothing came out. Because the truth was a problem. I didn't want to stop. Not even close. And saying that out loud felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. So I didn't say it. I didn't have to. Larry saw it anyway. He exhaled quietly, almost like he already knew. Yeah, he said under his breath. That was enough. More than enough. Because now it wasn't just tension anymore. It was choice. A conscious one. We both knew what this could cost. We both saw the risk. And still, we stayed. Not because we didn't understand. But because we did, and chose it anyway. That was the moment everything changed. Not when we met. Not when we got close. But when we decided not to walk away. Because after that, it wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was something we were actively risking everything for. After that night, we stopped pretending there was a way to keep this safe. We still acted careful, of course we did. That part never went away. But something in the intention changed. Before, it was all hesitation. Testing boundaries. Seeing how close we could get without crossing anything obvious. Now, we both knew we were already past that. The gym didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't just a place we happened to be at the same time. It became something else. A cover. We still worked out. Still kept our distance when people were around. But the real moments happened in between. Short conversations. Passing each other just a little too close. That awareness that never really faded. Every time it built. Every time it got harder to ignore. A few days later, it finally tipped. It was late again. Quieter than usual. Only a handful of people left. I finished my set and stood there for a second, catching my breath, when I felt him behind me. Not touching. Just there. "You're distracted," Larry said quietly. I let out a short breath. "Whose fault is that?" A faint hint of a smile. "Fair." I turned slightly, enough to look at him without making it obvious. "This is getting harder," I admitted. "I know." That answer again. Simple. Honest. Dangerous. I glanced around quickly, no one paying attention, at least not obviously. Still, my voice dropped. "We can't keep doing this here." Larry's expression shifted slightly. "I was thinking the same thing." That caught me off guard. Because that meant. "You mean stop?" I asked. He shook his head once. "No." A pause. Then, quieter. "I mean not here." That hit differently. My chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from the implication. "You're serious?" I asked. "Yeah. That's worse." "Is it?" "Yes," I said immediately. "Here, at least we blend in. Outside." "I know." He stepped a little closer, still controlled, still subtle. "But here is where people already started noticing." That shut me up. Because he was right. Again. "You trust me?" he asked. The question came out of nowhere. Or maybe it had been building this whole time. I hesitated. Not because I didn't understand what he was asking, but because I did. Trust, in that situation, wasn't small. It wasn't just about him. It was about everything. "What are you suggesting?" I asked instead. "Not here," he repeated. "Somewhere we don't have to watch every second." "That doesn't exist," I said. "It does," he replied calmly. "Just not in public." There it was. Clear. Direct. No room to misinterpret. My heart started beating faster, not panic, not exactly, but something close. Because this was the line. Everything before, plausible deniability. Accidental. Situational. This was a decision. "You're asking me to trust you a lot," I said quietly. "I know. And if this goes wrong?" "It won't." "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I know I'm not going to put you in a bad position." I studied him for a second. Really looked. Trying to find doubt. Hesitation. Anything that would make this easier to shut down. There wasn't any. Just that same steady confidence he always had. And somehow, that made it harder to say no. "This is risky," I said again. "Everything about this is risky." "Yeah." Silence stretched between us. Louder this time. He didn't push. Didn't rush me. Just waited. And that, more than anything, made the decision feel like it was actually mine. I exhaled slowly, looking away for a second. Thinking. Weighing it. All the reasons this was a bad idea. All the ways this could go wrong. And then, the one reason I was still standing there. "I can't stay long," I said finally. It came out quieter than I expected, But it was an answer. Larry nodded once. Okay. No reaction beyond that. No visible satisfaction. Just acceptance. When? I asked. Tonight. Of course. No time to overthink it. No time to back out. My chest tightened again. That's fast. You'd change your mind otherwise. He wasn't wrong. I let out a quiet breath. Where? I'll text you the address. That made me pause. We don't have each other's numbers. Then we should fix that. Right. Of course. I pulled out my phone, hesitating for just a second before handing it to him. This felt bigger than it should. Like crossing another invisible line. He typed his number in, then handed it back. Our fingers brushed again. This time, either of us reacted. Which somehow felt even more intense. Gareth, he said quietly. I looked up. If you're not sure, don't come. That surprised me. You just said I would back out. I did. Then why say that? Because I'd rather you not come, than come and regret it. That stuck. More than anything else he'd said. I nodded slowly. Okay. And just like that. It was set. No more pretending. No more accidental moments. That night, I was either going to walk away for real, or step into something I couldn't take back. I almost didn't go. I sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like hours, phone in my hand, staring at the address he'd sent like it might change if I looked at it long enough. It was across the city. Not too far, but far enough that no one from my usual routine would be there by accident. That was intentional. Everything about this was intentional. And that's what made it so much heavier. Because now, if I went, there was no pretending it just happened. This would be a choice. A clear one. I checked the time again. Too late to back out without it being obvious. Too early to pretend I'd just gotten busy. I could still not go. Delete the message. Block the number. End it here. Clean. Safe. Smart. I exhaled slowly, running a hand over my face. Then I stood up. So much for smart. The walk there felt longer than it should have. Every step, my brain kept running through worst-case scenarios. What if someone saw me? What if this was a mistake? What if I was walking straight into something I couldn't control? By the time I reached his building, my chest was tight again, but not enough to turn around. Apparently. I stood outside for a second, staring at the entrance. Normal building. Nothing special. Which somehow made it feel even more surreal. This was happening in the same world where everything else existed. Not hidden. Not separate. Just quietly out of place. My phone buzzed. Larry, you here? I hesitated for half a second. Then, me, yeah? A few seconds later, the door unlocked. That was it. No going back now. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. Every sound felt louder. My footsteps, my breathing, even the way my hand brushed against the wall as I walked. Apartment 3B. I stopped in front of the door. Just stood there. For a second, two, maybe longer. Then I knocked. The door opened almost immediately. And there he was. Larry. Different somehow. Not physically, but the context changed everything. No gym. No noise. No people. Just him. Just me. And suddenly, all the space we'd kept between us before felt gone. You came, he said. I let out a quiet breath. Yeah. A pause. Then he stepped aside, letting me in. The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt way louder than it should have. We were alone. For real this time. No witnesses. No distractions. No easy way to pretend this was accidental. I stood there for a second, taking it in. Simple place. Clean. Nothing personal out in the open. Careful. Of course. You want a drink? He asked. I shook my head. No. Okay. Silence. thicker than anything before. Because now, there was nothing stopping us except ourselves. And that line? We'd already crossed it. You nervous? He asked. I let out a short breath. Yeah. Good, he said quietly. I frowned slightly. Good? Means you understand what this is. Fair. I glanced at the door behind me for a second. Then back at him. We can still stop. The words came out automatically. Like a final checkpoint. Larry didn't move closer this time. Didn't push. He just looked at me. Do you want to? That question again. Simple. Direct. And impossible to answer the way I should have. Because standing there, looking at him, feeling everything that had built over the past weeks. No, I said quietly. And that was it. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just final. The last chance to walk away. Gone. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not relief. Just confirmation. He stepped closer. Slow enough that I could have stepped back if I wanted to. I didn't. And when he stopped in front of me, closer than we'd ever been before, everything else faded. The fear. The risk. All of it. Replaced by something simpler. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Real. His hand brushed mine first. Deliberate this time. Not accidental. Not something we could pretend didn't happen. My breath caught slightly, but I didn't move away. Didn't even think about it. Because this was what all of it had been building toward. Every look. Every conversation. Every moment we didn't walk away. And when I finally looked up at him, close enough now that there was no space left to hide anything, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before. This wasn't just risk anymore. It wasn't just rebellion. It wasn't even just attraction. It was connection. Real, undeniable, and completely forbidden. And that made it the most dangerous thing of all. Everything that happened after that stayed behind that door. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. Because in a place where even being who we were could cost everything, some things had to stay ours. The only thing I'll say is this. When I left later that night, nothing felt the same anymore. Not the city. Not the rules. Not even myself. Because once you've felt something real like that, it's impossible to go back to pretending you don't need it. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. For a second, I didn't remember why. Then it hit me all at once. Where I'd been. What I'd done. Who I'd been with. I stared at the ceiling, my chest already tight, not from panic exactly, but from the weight of it settling in. Because it wasn't just a moment anymore. It wasn't just something I could file away as a mistake and move on from. It had changed something. And I felt it immediately. Everything felt sharper. Louder. More real. Which, in a place like that, was dangerous. I got ready for work like usual. Same routine. Same neutral expression. Same careful version of myself I'd been playing for years. But underneath that, nothing was the same. I caught myself in the mirror before leaving. For a second, I didn't recognize the look in my own eyes. Not fear. Not even regret. Just awareness. Like I'd finally stopped lying to myself. I didn't go to the gym that day. Or the next. Not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to think. Needed to understand what this actually meant. Because now it wasn't just about risk. It was about what came after. There was no version of this that stayed contained. No version where we just met once and went back to normal. I knew that. And so did he. On the third day, my phone buzzed. Larry, you okay? I stared at the message longer than I should have. Then, me, yeah? A second later. Larry, you sure? I exhaled slowly. Me, just thinking. There was a pause. Then, Larry, about stopping? Straight to it. Of course. I leaned back against the wall, staring at the screen. That word again. Stopping. Like it was still an option. Like we hadn't already crossed too many lines. I typed. Deleted it. Typed again. Finally. Me, about what this actually is. A few seconds passed. Then, Larry and I hesitated. Because the truth wasn't simple. It wasn't just attraction. Wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't something I could shut off now that I'd let it in. It was something I'd been denying for years. And now that it had a face, a name, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Me, it's not something I can keep doing halfway. The reply came slower this time. Larry, I know. That hit. Because it meant he was thinking the same thing. I ran a hand through my hair, pacing slightly. Me, which means it either stops. I stared at the screen for a second. Then finished it. Me, or it doesn't. The typing bubble appeared. Disappeared. Came back again. Then finally. Larry, and if it doesn't? That question. That was everything. Because that wasn't just about us. That was about the country. The rules. The consequences. The reality we lived in. If it doesn't stop, what does that cost? I didn't answer right away. Because for the first time, I actually let myself think about it fully. Not just the risk of getting caught, but the alternative. Going back to before. Pretending. Hiding. Living half a life because it was safer. I thought about the gym. Those quiet moments. The way I felt when I was with him, compared to everything else. And the answer came before I could stop it. Me, then it means I stopped pretending. I stared at the message after I sent it. Heart pounding. Because that wasn't small. That wasn't careful. That was a decision. The typing bubble came back almost immediately this time. Larry, that's not something you say unless you mean it. I swallowed. Me, I know. A pause. Then, Larry, you understand what that could lead to? Yeah. I did. More than I wanted to. Me, yeah? Another pause. Longer. He was thinking. Weighing it. Just like I had. Then finally. Larry, then don't do it for me. I frowned slightly at the screen. Me, I'm not. And that was the truth. For the first time in my life, it actually was. That night, I went back to the gym. Not because it was safe. Not because it made sense. But because avoiding it didn't change anything anymore. When I walked in, it felt different again. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just clear. I saw him almost immediately. And this time, I didn't look away. Neither did he. No pretending. No hesitation. Just a quiet understanding that whatever this was, we weren't running from it anymore. Not completely. Not blindly either. We were still careful. Still aware. We had to be. But something had shifted. Not recklessness. Not stupidity. Just honesty. And weirdly enough, that made it feel less dangerous than before. Because now it wasn't about slipping up. It was about choosing it, fully aware of what it meant. I walked past him, close enough to speak without drawing attention. Still a bad idea, I muttered. A faint smile. Yeah, he said. I exhaled quietly. Then added, but I'm not stopping. There was a brief pause. Then, just as quietly, good. I'm not going to tell you this ends perfectly. It doesn't. That's not how stories like this go. We stayed careful. We had close calls. Moments where we had to pull back, disappear for a while, act like strangers again. That part never fully went away. But neither did we. Because once you've lived your whole life hiding, and then you find something real, something that makes you feel seen, understood, alive, you realize something important. The risk was always there. The only difference now was that I chose something worth the risk. And in a place where it was forbidden. That choice meant everything.